I never expected to become a farmer at 35. But when that certified letter arrived, claiming the HOA owned the mineral rights to my grandfather's land, I knew something wasn't right, especially when I discovered their president had forged documents while Grandpa was in the hospital. The letter trembled in my hands as I sat at the kitchen table, my coffee growing cold beside me. "This must be a mistake," I whispered to the empty room. I read it again. According to the Sycamore Heights Homeowners Association, they owned all the mineral rights to my grandfather's farm, my farm now, and planned to start digging up my land in just 4 weeks. Grandpa's funeral was barely 2 months ago. After he passed, I'd left my cramped apartment and soul-crushing accounting job in the city to take over his 15-acre property in Willow Creek. The farm had been in our family for 3 generations. I spent every childhood summer here, helping Grandpa tend the peach orchard, gathering eggs, and learning how the land breathes with the seasons. I grabbed my phone and dialed the number on the letterhead. After being transferred 3 times, a clipped voice answered. "Margaret Holloway speaking. HOA President. Ms. Holloway, I'm calling about this letter claiming your association owns the mineral rights to my property. There must be some confusion." "No confusion at all, Mr. Mitchell," she responded coolly. "Your grandfather signed the agreement 2 years ago. Our geological survey found significant limestone deposits beneath your eastern field. Excavation begins next month. The paperwork is quite clear." "No, Grandpa would never—" "Perhaps you didn't know him as well as you thought," she interrupted. "The agreement is legally binding. Good day." She hung up before I could speak another word. I sat stunned, my mind racing, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Outside the kitchen window, the morning light spilled across the fields Grandpa had worked his entire life. He taught me everything about this land, how to read the soil, when to plant, which trees needed extra care. He'd sooner cut off his own hand than sign away any part of this farm. That afternoon, I drove to the edge of my property, where it bordered Sycamore Heights. The development was only 5 years old. Rows of identical 2-story houses with perfect lawns and identical mailboxes. So different from the weathered beauty of Grandpa's farm. A woman was gardening in the yard closest to my fence line. She straightened when she saw me approach. "You must be Tom's grandson," she said, pulling off her gloves. "I'm Elaine Watson. I'm so sorry about your grandfather. He was a wonderful neighbor." "Did you know him well?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "As well as anyone, I suppose. He brought me fresh peaches every summer." Her eyes darted toward her front door before she added in a lower voice, "Be careful with that HOA. Margaret's had her eye on your property since they broke ground here." "What do you mean?" I asked, curiosity and caution creeping into my voice. Elaine glanced around, ensuring no one was listening. "She's always talking about expanding the community footprint. Your grandfather refused to sell, even when they offered him well above market value." A car door slammed nearby, and Elaine quickly put her gardening gloves back on. "I should get back to my flowers. The HOA only allows certain approved plants. Got cited last month for unauthorized hostas," she added with a forced laugh, clearly eager to end the conversation. As I walked back toward my house, I spotted a silver SUV cruising slowly past. The driver, a stern-faced woman with immaculate gray hair, stared at me with undisguised interest. That night, I couldn't sleep. I pulled out Grandpa's old metal filing cabinet and began digging through decades of paperwork, tax forms, equipment receipts, seed catalogs, anything that might shed light on this situation. There was nothing about mineral rights. At 2 a.m., I found a folder labeled Property Documents containing the original deed from 1963 when Grandpa bought the place from the Wilson family. I read every line carefully. The deed explicitly stated that all mineral rights conveyed with the property, with no provisions for separation. According to this, no one but the property owner could claim those rights. The next morning, I drove to the county records office. The clerk, an older man named Frank, with reading glasses perched on his nose, helped me search through the property records. "Here's the original deed," he said, pointing to a document that matched what I'd found in Grandpa's cabinet. "And here's the property tax history, building permits, boundary adjustments, when they put in the county road in '87. "What about any transfer of mineral rights?" I asked. Frank adjusted his glasses. "Let me check." "Huh, that's odd." He turned his computer screen so I could see it. There is a mineral rights transfer filed 2 years ago, signed by Thomas Mitchell, transferring all subsurface rights to the Sycamore Heights Community Development Corporation. My stomach dropped. Can I see the actual document? I asked. Frank printed a copy. There it was, a legal-looking document with what appeared to be Grandpa's signature at the bottom, dated April 15th, 2022. But something felt wrong. I studied the signature closely. Do you have any other documents my grandfather signed on file for comparison? Frank found a property tax appeal from 5 years ago. When he laid the documents side by side, I could see subtle differences in the signatures. Grandpa's distinctive looping T was missing from the mineral rights transfer. As I drove home, my phone rang. It was my Aunt Susan, Grandpa's youngest sister. I got your message, she said, about Grandpa supposedly signing over mineral rights. Did he ever mention anything about it to you? Never, I replied, gripping the steering wheel. Wait, you mentioned the date, April 15th? That's when the document was supposedly signed, right? Yes, Aunt Susan replied. But Tom, that's when Grandpa had his stroke. He was in the hospital from April 2nd to the 27th. He couldn't even hold a pen for weeks afterward. I visited him every day. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. The signature is forged, I said, the words finally clicking into place. It has to be. What are you going to do? Aunt Susan asked. I pulled into my driveway and stared at the farmhouse. The sun was setting over the fields Grandpa had worked for 50 years. This farm stayed in our family, whatever it took, but now I had to figure out how to prove it. The next few days felt like an endless stretch of hours, each one filled with frustration and a growing sense of urgency. Every time I passed by Grandpa's peach orchard, I could almost hear his voice, his laughter as we worked side by side, preparing the trees for the coming seasons. But now the air was thick with tension, and the very land that had given us so much was being threatened by a scheme I couldn't fully understand yet. That evening, I stayed up late, poring over the documents from the county records office. The forged mineral rights transfer weighed heavily in my hands. How could this have happened? Grandpa would never have signed anything, especially something that would jeopardize the farm. The more I stared at the papers, the more I realized that someone close, had betrayed us. I decided to pay another visit to the Sycamore Heights development the next morning. The community was quiet, its pristine lawns and perfectly manicured homes glaring in the daylight, like a sterile, artificial bubble. I'd always known the development was there, but until now I hadn't given it much thought. Now it felt like an enemy camp just on the other side of my fence. As I drove along the dirt road toward the back of the property, I noticed a man with a clipboard walking along the perimeter, scribbling something down on a sheet of paper. I slowed down, rolled down my window and called out to him. Hey, what's going on here? The man looked up, startled for a moment, but quickly regained his composure. Just taking measurements for future expansion, he said, his voice flat, disinterested. Expansion? What kind of expansion? He hesitated, clearly trying to gauge whether he should answer me. Nothing to do with you, sir. You'll be informed when it's all finalized. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to get out of the truck and confront him. I'll be keeping an eye on things, I said, not bothering to hide the edge in my voice. The man nodded, turned, and walked back to the rows of identical houses. As I drove back to the farmhouse, I thought about the strange encounter. Expansion? They were planning something big. But why were they so vague, so unwilling to explain what was going on? And why did it feel like they were trying to keep me out of the loop? The following day, I decided to confront Margaret Holloway directly. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became that she was behind everything. Her name kept coming up in every conversation I had with neighbors, and I couldn't shake the feeling that her ambitions extended far beyond what she let on. I called her office first thing in the morning. Ms. Holloway, this is Tom Mitchell, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I need to speak with you about the mineral rights claim. I know the signature is a forgery. You've got no right to any part of my land. The line was silent for a long moment, and then she spoke, her tone icy. Mr. Mitchell, I'm afraid you don't know what you're talking about. The agreement is legal, and the matter is settled. I suggest you stop wasting time and prepare to vacate the property. The excavation will begin in a few weeks. Excavation? On my land? You're not getting away with this, I snapped. But before I could say anything else, she hung up. The anger that bubbled up inside me was almost too much to contain. I felt the familiar urge to walk out into the fields, grab the tools Grandpa had left behind, and get to work. But the farm wasn't just about hard work. It was about preserving a legacy that was now in jeopardy. I knew I needed proof. Proof of the forgery. Proof of what had really happened behind the scenes. That afternoon, I drove into town, hoping to find some answers. My first stop was the county courthouse. I had to find any document, any piece of paper that could help me build a case against the HOA and their illegal claim. When I walked in, the familiar smell of old paper and dust greeted me, and the clerk behind the desk gave me a nod as I approached. "I'm looking for any documents related to my property," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, "particularly anything connected to the mineral rights transfer." The clerk, an older woman with silver-rimmed glasses, typed something into her computer and then turned the screen toward me. "Here we go," she said, pulling up the file. "There was a transfer 2 years ago, signed by your grandfather." My heart skipped a beat. I felt the blood rush to my head as she handed me the printed document. The signature was there, plain as day, but something about it made my skin crawl. The more I stared at it, the more I realized that it didn't look like Grandpa's writing at all. It was too neat, too uniform. "You have any other documents that he signed?" I asked, trying to mask the growing sense of dread. The clerk checked again and found a few older forms. She laid them next to the mineral rights transfer. I couldn't believe my eyes. There were subtle differences. Grandpa's distinctive looping T was missing. His signature had a unique flow to it, a characteristic he always carried. But this one? This was a lie. "I need a copy of this," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "Of course," the clerk replied, not sensing the urgency in my tone. She made a copy of the document and handed it to me. But as I walked out, I felt the weight of what I had just uncovered press heavily on my chest. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a deliberate act of fraud. Later that evening, I sat at my kitchen table, the pile of documents spread out before me. The gravity of the situation settled in. This wasn't just about a piece of paper or a signature. It was about the entire farm. It was about my family's history, our land, and a battle that was just beginning. I knew now what I had to do. I wasn't going to let Margaret Holloway steal my grandfather's legacy, and if I had to fight every step of the way, I would, whatever it took. The days following my discovery passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and sleepless nights. I had uncovered the forgery. Now I just needed to build a case strong enough to expose Margaret Holloway and the Sycamore Heights HOA for what they really were: fraudsters trying to steal my land. But it wasn't enough to simply find a forged signature. I needed evidence, proof that my grandfather never signed the mineral rights transfer and that Margaret had orchestrated the whole thing. I started by contacting everyone who might know something useful. My first call was to Aunt Susan. She had already confirmed that Grandpa was in the hospital when the document was supposedly signed. I needed more: medical records, testimonies, anything that could back up the timeline. After getting off the phone with her, I drove to the hospital where Grandpa had been treated. The records department was more helpful than I expected. They confirmed that Grandpa had been an inpatient from April 2nd to April 27th, 2022, following his stroke. His physical therapy notes specifically mentioned that he had no grip strength in his right hand during that period, meaning he couldn't possibly have signed anything on the 15th. Armed with that confirmation, I returned to the county records office to dig deeper. Frank, the clerk, was there again. He recognized me and smiled kindly. "Back again, huh?" he asked as I approached. "Yeah," I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "I need to look into something further. I've found a few inconsistencies in the mineral rights transfer document. I need to dig deeper into who notarized it." Frank raised an eyebrow. "That's odd. I'll pull up the details for you." He clicked away at his computer, and a moment later, he pulled up a name: Judith Holloway. The name hit me like a punch to the stomach. Of course! Judith was Margaret's sister-in-law, the one who worked in the Sycamore Heights development office. I knew something didn't feel right, I muttered to myself as Frank printed out the documents. Judith Holloway was the notary. She's the one who likely notarized the forged transfer. There's no way she should have been involved. Frank handed me the printout. There you go. It's all here. I stared at the paper, feeling a mix of anger and dread. Judith Holloway's involvement was a crucial piece of the puzzle, but I knew I couldn't do this alone. I needed professional help, a lawyer who could navigate the complexities of property law, fraud, and forgery. I spent the next few hours on the phone, calling every attorney in town. The first few hung up before I even finished my explanation. The next few were hesitant, citing potential conflicts of interest, but wouldn't elaborate. By the time I called the last one, I was about ready to give up. "Mr. Mitchell, this is James Rodriguez," a voice on the other end of the line said. "I'm retired, but I've been a lawyer for over 30 years. What's going on? You sound like you're in a tough spot." I explained everything: the forged signature, the mineral rights transfer, and the connection to the HOA and Judith Holloway. He listened intently, asking a few questions here and there. "You've got a serious case on your hands," James said after a long pause. "I'm going to help you, but we'll need to move fast. If what you're saying is true, this could be criminal fraud." My heart lifted. I finally had someone in my corner. James agreed to meet me the next day to go over the details and strategize our next steps. In the meantime, I continued gathering documents. I spent hours at the courthouse, piecing together every bit of information I could find about the Sycamore Heights HOA's activities: property transfers, financial records, anything that could link Margaret and her associates to a larger scheme. By the time James arrived at my farm the following afternoon, I had stacks of papers ready. He was a retired attorney with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. He studied the documents carefully, asking me questions and jotting down notes. When he finished, he looked up at me with a determined expression. "We've got a case," he said, "but it's not going to be easy. Margaret Holloway's well-connected, and she has plenty of powerful friends in this town. We'll need more than just forged documents to take her down. We'll need public awareness, expert testimony, and ironclad evidence." I nodded. "I've already got a geologist lined up. I'm going to have soil samples tested to prove that there's nothing valuable under my land. We'll need to expose the HOA's claim as a fraud." "That's a good start," James agreed, "but we'll also need a handwriting expert. The forgery expert will be crucial. We need someone who can testify that the signature on that transfer is a fake." We spent the next several hours planning our attack. James would help me prepare the legal challenge, and we'd file it with the county court. Meanwhile, I would continue digging into the HOA's finances and activities. Every piece of information mattered now. The more I learned, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about mineral rights. This was about power, greed, and the lengths people would go to for profit. Before James left, he turned to me. "I'm not going to lie, Tom. This is going to be a fight. But I'll tell you one thing. We're on the right side. Your grandfather built something here that's worth protecting. We're not just fighting for your farm. We're fighting for what's right." I watched him drive away, my mind swirling with plans and possibilities. But one thing was certain: I was no longer alone in this fight. I had an attorney, a geologist, and a whole community ready to take a stand. As the sun set over the farm, I stood by the fence, looking out over the eastern field, the land Margaret had coveted. I wasn't going to let her take it. I wasn't going to let her destroy everything Grandpa had built. This was just the beginning. The battle was about to get much harder, but I was ready. Whatever it took, I would protect this land, and I would expose the truth. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. I spent every waking hour gathering more evidence, poring over documents, and meeting with James, the lawyer who had agreed to take on my case. His calm demeanor and years of experience helped me stay focused during moments when I was tempted to let frustration get the better of me. But even with all the documents, even with the proof that my grandfather never signed the mineral rights transfer, I knew that Margaret and her people were going to fight back. Hard. The first thing James and I needed to do was find an expert who could testify that the signature on the mineral rights transfer was indeed forged. It wasn't enough to just claim it was a forgery. We needed an expert to back it up. "I know a guy," James said one afternoon as we sat in my kitchen, going over the documents once again. "A forensic handwriting expert. He's retired, but he still takes on cases now and then. I'll make the call." I nodded. We needed someone credible, someone who could stand in court and say, with certainty, that the signature was not my grandfather's. As James made the call, I began to feel the weight of the situation bearing down on me. The more I uncovered, the more I realized just how deep this went. Margaret Holloway had her fingers in every aspect of the Sycamore Heights development, and if she was willing to forge documents to steal my land, what else was she capable of? I spent the next few days in town, speaking to anyone who might know something about the HOA's financial dealings or any shady activities going on in Sycamore Heights. It wasn't long before I ran into Sarah Thompson, one of the homeowners from Sycamore Heights who had already reached out to me. She had been quietly organizing the neighbors who were fed up with Margaret's heavy-handed tactics. "I've been digging into the HOA's finances," Sarah said, her voice low as we met in a coffee shop away from the prying eyes of Margaret's supporters. "I've found some discrepancies. There's money missing, about $200,000. It was supposed to go toward a community project, but it never made it." I leaned forward, my heart racing. "What do you mean? Where did the money go?" Sarah pulled out a folder from her bag and opened it to reveal bank statements and financial records. "Look at these transfers," she said, pointing to a few entries. "The money was funneled into an account that's connected to a private shell company, the same one that's been involved in land deals around here. I think Margaret and her husband have been using the HOA as a front to push their own agenda. They've been stealing from the community." I stared at the records, feeling a sense of sick realization settle in. This wasn't just about the farm. Margaret was running a criminal enterprise using the HOA as a cover, and now it was all coming to light. "That's it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "That's what they're after, the land. It's not just about the mineral rights. It's about the property value increase from this development and the highway exit. And now they've been embezzling from the HOA to fund their scheme." Sarah nodded grimly. "I don't know how deep it goes, but we're going to find out. The community is starting to wake up, Tom. People are getting fed up. Margaret's not going to be able to keep this up much longer." As Sarah left, I felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. People were starting to see the truth, and with that, we had the power to take Margaret down. The next day, I met with the handwriting expert James had called. His name was Richard, and he had the air of someone who'd spent decades in the business of scrutinizing signatures. His office was filled with old case files and magnifying glasses, and the smell of old paper lingered in the air. I handed him the mineral rights transfer document and Grandpa's other signatures for comparison. Richard didn't say much at first. He simply examined the signatures under a magnifying glass, carefully noting the differences. "I've seen enough," he finally said, looking up at me with a solemn expression. "This is a clear forgery. The loops in the T are missing, and the flow of the signature is inconsistent with your grandfather's writing. Whoever did this knew how to make it look good, but they made some rookie mistakes. It's a fake." I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, but at the same time, the gravity of the situation sank in even deeper. This wasn't just a minor oversight. This was a deliberate crime. "We've got what we need," Richard said, "but you'll need to present this evidence in court. I'll be available to testify if needed." "Thank you, Richard," I said, shaking his hand. "You don't know how much this means." As I left Richard's office, I felt the first real sense of victory I had in weeks. The forgery had been proven. We had the handwriting expert's testimony, the medical records confirming Grandpa couldn't have signed the document, and Sarah's financial evidence showing the HOA's illegal activities. We had everything we needed. But as I made my way back to the farm, I knew the real battle was just beginning. The next few weeks would be crucial. Margaret Holloway wouldn't go down without a fight, and I had no doubt she'd do everything in her power to stop us from exposing her lies. The bulldozers were still coming, and with the HOA's deep pockets and connections, I was sure they wouldn't hesitate to resort to even dirtier tactics. But I wasn't going to back down. I had the truth on my side, and the people of Sycamore Heights were starting to see it too. We were going to fight for this land, and we were going to win. That night I stood on the porch of the farmhouse, looking out at the eastern field, the place where they wanted to dig up the earth, the place where my grandfather's legacy was rooted. The battle was coming, and I was ready to stand my ground. The next few weeks felt like a never-ending spiral of tension and anticipation. With each passing day, Margaret Holloway's plans for the mineral rights and the bulldozers inched closer to reality. But now I had the evidence to fight back. I just needed to find a way to present it in such a way that the truth couldn't be denied. James and I worked relentlessly to prepare for the inevitable legal battle. The forgery was the cornerstone of our case, but we needed more to build a strong defense. The financial discrepancies Sarah had uncovered were crucial. It wasn't just about a piece of land or a forged signature anymore. It was about criminal activity on a scale that could bring the entire Sycamore Heights development crashing down. But even with all the evidence, there was a lingering doubt in my mind. Margaret was powerful. Her family had connections everywhere, especially with the county officials. I wasn't naive enough to think that this would be an easy fight, but I had something she didn't: the truth. And the people of Sycamore Heights were starting to rally behind me. One evening, I received a call from Sarah. Her voice was shaky but determined. "Tom, I've got news. We're not the only ones watching Margaret. A group of us. Well, we've been gathering evidence on her for months. There's more we can show you. She's been manipulating the homeowners association for years, using it to funnel money into personal accounts and to fund illegal land deals." I sat up straighter, my heart pounding. "What do you mean? What have you found?" Sarah hesitated before continuing. "I've been in contact with a few people who've been watching the HOA's financial records. There are transactions, large sums of money going to companies that Margaret's family controls. It's all connected. We've got bank records, receipts, even internal HOA emails that show she's been using the association for personal gain." I felt a surge of hope. This wasn't just a battle for the farm anymore. This was bigger. This was about exposing corruption and greed at the highest level. "We can do this, Sarah," I said, my voice steady. "We've got the proof we need. We'll go public, take it to the media. We'll make sure everyone knows what Margaret's been up to." The next day, Sarah and I met at a local coffee shop to go over the new evidence. She laid out the documents in front of me: bank transfers, email chains, and detailed records that linked Margaret to multiple shady land deals. It was clear as day. Margaret Holloway had been using the HOA as a front for her own financial gain. She'd manipulated the system, deceived the residents, and had even stolen from them to fund her schemes. But it was the emails that were the most damning. They contained discussions about acquiring land under false pretenses and pushing through the mineral rights deal with promises of huge payouts to the developers. "This is it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We've got her. We've got everything we need to expose her." Sarah nodded. "But we need to go public with it. The community needs to see this, Tom. People need to understand what's really going on before it's too late." We spent the next few days organizing everything. We contacted the local news station, shared the evidence with a few trusted residents, and prepared a public statement. We knew the HOA would try to silence us, but we had the truth on our side. And more importantly, we had a growing movement of people who were ready to stand up to Margaret. The day we decided to go public, I woke up early. The sky was overcast and the wind rustled through the trees outside the farmhouse. I stood on the porch, looking out over the land Grandpa had worked so hard to build. His legacy was in my hands now, and I wouldn't let anyone take it from me. By mid-morning, the news vans started arriving. They parked along the dirt road near the farm, their cameras ready to roll. Sarah, Elaine, and a few other residents from Sycamore Heights gathered around, each one holding signs that read "HOA fraud, support local farms, and stop Margaret." I walked out to the front of the farm, my heart pounding in my chest. The reporters gathered around me, their cameras clicking. I took a deep breath and began to speak. "For weeks, the Sycamore Heights Homeowners Association has claimed they own the mineral rights to this land," I said, holding up the forged mineral rights transfer document for the cameras. "They've used lies and deceit to try and steal my family's farm. But it's not just the land they've been after. They've been using the HOA to manipulate and defraud the residents of Sycamore Heights. We have the evidence to prove it." I laid out the details: the forged signature, the fraudulent financial records, and the evidence of corruption within the HOA. The crowd of residents cheered as I spoke, their support giving me strength. I wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Margaret's face was a picture of rage when she arrived, flanked by her lawyer and several security personnel. She marched toward me, her heels clicking on the gravel. "This is absurd," she spat, her voice trembling with fury. "You're slandering my name, Mr. Mitchell. You'll regret this." I stood my ground. The truth is on my side, Margaret. You can't hide it anymore. You've been using your position to manipulate and steal from the community, and you've been trying to steal my farm. But it's over now. The people know what you've done. Margaret's eyes narrowed and she turned on her heels, heading back to her SUV. Her lawyer muttered something to the reporters before hurriedly following her, but the damage had already been done. The truth was out in the open, and the residents of Sycamore Heights were starting to demand answers. That evening, as the sun set behind the fields, I felt a sense of relief wash over me. The battle was far from over, but we had taken the first major step toward winning it. The community was with me, and the truth was on our side. James called that night to check in. "We're in a good position, Tom," he said, "but Margaret's not going to give up. She'll try everything she can to discredit you. We need to be ready for her next move." "I'm ready," I said, looking out over the fields. "This is my land, my grandfather's land, and I won't let her take it." As I hung up the phone, I felt more determined than ever. The fight for this land had just begun, but I wasn't going to back down. Margaret might have thought she had power, but what she didn't understand was that the truth was more powerful than any lie she could spread. And as long as I had the support of the community and the evidence to prove it, I was ready to take her down. The farm would stay in the family just like Grandpa wanted, and I was going to make sure of it. The following days were a blur of activity, strategy meetings, and sleepless nights. The media had picked up the story and word spread quickly about the scandal surrounding Margaret Holloway and the Sycamore Heights Homeowners Association. The truth was finally out in the open, but Margaret wasn't the type to back down easily. She had connections, resources, and the determination to fight dirty if it meant protecting her empire. The pressure was mounting. As I prepared for the inevitable legal battle, I couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret was going to retaliate in a way that we couldn't anticipate. She had already shown her ruthlessness, and now with her back against the wall, I feared she would stop at nothing to win. James and I continued to work tirelessly on the case, going over every document, every piece of evidence we had gathered. Richard, the handwriting expert, was ready to testify. Sarah, Elaine, and a growing number of residents were backing us up, willing to speak out against the HOA's corruption. But despite all of this, I couldn't ignore the looming threat. The bulldozers were still scheduled to arrive in less than a week. One morning I received an unexpected visitor. It was Sarah, looking more determined than I had ever seen her. "Tom, I've been talking to some people. Margaret's trying to use her influence to make sure the courts delay everything. She's not just after your land anymore. She's after everyone's trust," Sarah said, her voice low. "She's telling everyone that you're making up lies about her and the HOA. She's trying to turn the community against us." I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I knew it was coming. She won't give up until she's ruined everything. "I'm not so sure, Tom," Sarah said, her voice growing stronger. "I spoke to some of the older folks in the development. They're starting to realize they've been misled. They want to help us. They're tired of being lied to." I looked at her, a glimmer of hope sparking in my chest. "You think they're with us?" Sarah nodded. "They're ready to act. But we need to hit her where it hurts, publicly. We can't let her control the narrative anymore." That night I sat in front of my computer, reviewing the latest evidence we had gathered. As I sifted through the emails and financial documents, something caught my eye. An email thread between Margaret and some of her developers, discussing plans to clear more land for future expansion, specifically targeting the area where Grandpa's peach orchard lay. It wasn't just about mineral rights or a highway anymore. They were planning to destroy the farm entirely, cutting down the trees, bulldozing the land, and turning it into more cookie-cutter houses. I felt a surge of anger. They wanted to turn everything Grandpa had worked for into more concrete. This was no longer just a fight to keep the farm. It was a fight to preserve the life and history of Willow Creek. I called James immediately. "We've got to act fast. I found the final piece of the puzzle. Margaret and her developers are planning to destroy the farm, not just for the mineral rights, but to expand Sycamore Heights. They're planning to clear the orchard." James's voice was steady, but I could hear the urgency in his tone. "We'll get this to the court. We'll use this to push for an immediate injunction to stop the excavation. If we can show the development is based on fraudulent claims, the judge might not be so willing to let Margaret continue." The following morning, James and I filed for the injunction. We presented our case to the judge, showing the forged signatures, the financial fraud, and now the plans to destroy the farm. The courtroom was filled with tension as we laid out our evidence, detailing the corrupt activities of Margaret and her associates. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on me, but I kept my focus on the judge. When Margaret's lawyer stood up to counter, he tried to discredit everything we had presented. He argued that the land was already in the process of being excavated and that any delay would cost the developers millions. But as he spoke, I could see the cracks in his argument. He was flailing, trying to protect a lie that was falling apart. Then it was Margaret's turn. She stood in front of the judge, her voice trembling with rage. "This man is trying to ruin everything we've worked for. The land is ours, legally. He's using every trick in the book to steal it from us." But just as she finished speaking, Sarah stepped forward with a stack of documents in her hands. "Your Honor, I have a statement from several residents of Sycamore Heights. We've seen the corruption firsthand. We've witnessed the manipulation and the deceit, and we have proof." The judge turned to Sarah. "What proof do you have, Ms. Thompson?" Sarah calmly laid the documents on the table, showing the bank statements, the emails, and the HOA's illegal transactions. She even presented testimonies from several residents, including Elaine and others who had grown disillusioned with Margaret's leadership. The room was silent as the judge reviewed the evidence. It was then that I realized how much support we had gathered. The community, the people who had once been so silent, were now speaking out. They weren't just defending me anymore. They were defending themselves, their homes, and their future. The judge took a long pause before speaking. "I believe the evidence is clear. The actions of the Sycamore Heights Homeowners Association, particularly those of Ms. Margaret Holloway, have been questionable at best and criminal at worst. I'm granting the injunction. The excavation will be delayed until further investigation can be conducted. Mr. Mitchell's property rights will be upheld." A wave of relief washed over me. We had won the first battle, but I knew this was far from over. Margaret wasn't going to give up without a fight. The moment we left the courthouse, I could feel the eyes of the community on me. The battle for the farm was far from over, but this victory was a major step forward. Margaret had been forced to retreat, for now. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees and the farmhouse grew quiet, I stood on the porch looking out over the fields. I could almost hear Grandpa's voice, his wisdom echoing in my mind. This land wasn't just about crops or minerals. It was about family, history, and the values that held it all together. As I stood there, I knew we weren't just fighting for the farm anymore. We were fighting for the soul of the community, and as long as I had breath in my body, I would fight for it, whatever it took. The weeks that followed were filled with a mixture of anticipation and relief. Margaret had been forced to retreat, but I knew she wouldn't give up easily. Every day I checked the farm, watching for any signs that her people were trying to bypass the court order. I kept in close contact with James, and who assured me that our case was strong. But Margaret was a fighter, and I couldn't afford to relax just yet. Then one morning, an unexpected visitor arrived at the farm. It was Sarah, but this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her stood several residents from Sycamore Heights, people who had once been hesitant to speak out, now standing beside me, their faces filled with determination. "We've had enough, Tom," Sarah said, her voice unwavering. "We've been talking, and we're ready to fight back. This isn't just your battle anymore. It's all of ours." I felt a lump rise in my throat as the residents stepped forward, each one carrying a piece of paper. They had filed their own suit against the HOA, demanding transparency and accountability. They were no longer afraid of Margaret, no longer intimidated by the power and influence she once held over them. The community had come together, united by the desire to protect what was rightfully theirs. Margaret Holloway's time was up. Her reign of manipulation and deceit had been exposed, and the people had finally begun to take back control. The lawsuit filed by the residents wasn't just about my farm anymore. It was about all the families who had suffered under her rule. With the legal battle moving in our favor, the final blow came when the county finally revoked Sycamore Heights' mineral rights claim. The documents were thrown out, and the fraudulent deeds were nullified. Margaret's financial records were seized by the authorities, and she was called to answer for the embezzlement and fraud. Her arrest was only a matter of time. It wasn't an easy fight, and it took every ounce of energy and perseverance to keep going. But when the news hit, when the press announced that Margaret Holloway had been arrested for fraud and embezzlement, the victory felt sweeter than I could have imagined. The farm was safe. My grandfather's legacy was intact. And more than that, I had witnessed the power of community, the strength of standing together against corruption and greed. The following spring, the orchard bloomed once more. The land that had been threatened, that had been on the verge of destruction, flourished under the care of the people who understood its value. Not just in minerals or property, but in its history, its family ties, and its connection to the earth. I stood in the middle of the field, looking out at the rows of peach trees. The breeze rustled the leaves, and for a moment, it felt like Grandpa was standing beside me again, just as he had when we worked together all those summers ago. Lesson from the story: the battle for my farm was more than just a personal victory. It was a reminder of the importance of standing up for what is right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. We often find ourselves in situations where the powerful seem to have control, where corruption thrives, and where those with the most resources can easily push others aside. But this story is a testament to the fact that the truth will always find a way to shine through. When we come together, when we fight not just for ourselves but for the greater good, we become a force that no one can silence. The strength of community, the power of standing united against injustice, and the belief that what is right will always prevail. Those are the values that saw us through. This story is not just about saving a farm. It's about recognizing the importance of history, of legacy, and of the collective power of the people who fight for what matters most. Whether it's land, family, or values, what we choose to protect today will shape the future. And in the end, it's not the power of money or influence that wins the day, but the courage to stand firm in the face of adversity.